Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to focus on scope in JavaScript. So to get started, if you can go ahead and go into your project folder, let's go ahead and go into the 30-scope folder, and then in the start subfolder, go ahead and open up main.js. Then in your web browser, if you can go ahead and open up index.html, you should see scope on the page. So scope in JavaScript is basically used to determine the accessibility or the visibility of variables in your code. So in JavaScript, there are two different types of scope, local and global. First, we're going to go ahead and focus on local scope. So local scope is when we declare a variable inside a function, that variable becomes local to that function. So we say the scope of that variable is local. So because that variable is local to that function, we cannot utilize that variable outside of that function. So for example, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a function, and I'm just going to call this test. And then inside the test function, I'm going to go ahead and create a variable. And I'm going to go ahead and call that variable x. And I'm just going to go ahead and set it equal to 1. So inside our function, I can go ahead and console log the value of x, and that value should get logged to the console. However, if I try to access x outside of my function, I should get an error because x should not exist. So if I go ahead and do console.log, and I go ahead and try to log my x variable, I should get an error. So if we save and refresh, we will see that we do get an error, and it says that x is not defined. And that's because this variable has local scope, and it can only be utilized here in our function. So before our console log of x, if we go ahead and call our test function, if we go ahead and save and refresh, you'll see that our x variable gets declared and initialized and has the value of 1. And we can go ahead and log that value. And once again, because that variable is scoped to that function, we cannot access it. So next, we'll have our global scope. So global scope is when we declare a variable outside of a function, then that variable is called a global variable. And a global variable can be accessed by anywhere in our script and in any of our functions. So if I go ahead and create a variable called y, and I go ahead and set it equal to 2, I should be able to right away go ahead and do console log y, and I can go ahead and make a new function, and I call this test2, and in this function I can access y. So if I console.log y, I should get the value. So then I'll go ahead and call our test2 function, and then we'll go ahead and save and refresh, and you'll see right away y is globally available, so we're able to access it outside of our function, and then we're also able to access it inside our function. So important thing to know about variables that are in your function: if you assign a variable to a variable that is not declared in your code, that variable will automatically become global, and then we'll be able to access it anywhere in our code. So for example, if I go ahead and do z equals 3, I can then access this variable outside of my function. So I should be able to do console.log z, and if we save and refresh, you see we're able to access that value. So another important thing to note about global variables is they become part of the window object, and we can access them anywhere in our code. So for example, in our developer console, I can do window.z, and you'll see I'm able to access that variable. So this is important to note because all global variables will belong to the window object. And this can have unintended consequences because if another window variable already exists with that variable name, our new value will go ahead and overwrite that variable. This also includes functions. And this is important because any function can go ahead and overwrite these global variables and functions. So if we're working with a bunch of different libraries, we could easily run into some collisions when we're using these global variables. So it's really important that we try not to, so it's really important to not create global variables unless you intend to. So next, I want to go ahead and talk about the lifetime of our JavaScript variables. So the lifetime of a JavaScript variable starts when that variable is declared. And when you have a global variable, that variable will stay alive until that browser tab or window is closed. So this is important to know because if you start creating a bunch of global variables, it's using up more and more of your computer's memory. Where a local variable will only last as long as that function is running. So you'll see when we call our test function, we declare a new variable, so it gets stored in memory. And then once we get to the end of our function and exit out, that variable is now cleaned up and destroyed. So one last thing I want to talk about is we've been talking about scope when we use the var keyword. And if we use the let and the const keywords, the scope is almost the same, but there are a few differences. One key difference is if we do declare a variable with the let keyword, so if I go a, and I go ahead and set it equal to a, all right, and then I'm also going to do const b will equal b. One important thing to note is normally if we would declare these variables with the var keyword, they would be global variables and they'd be accessible on our window object. So if we go ahead and save and refresh our page, and if we do window and we try to do .a, we'll get undefined, and if we do window.b, we'll also get undefined. And so what's happening here is when you use these two keywords to declare your global variables, they are still technically global variables because they can be accessed within our functions. However, they will not be added to the window object. And this is important because that means we can utilize these global variables and they will not overwrite any existing global values that are on our window object. So for example, if I do A, you'll see I get my string value of A, and if I do B, I get the string value of B, because these two variables are still global, they're just not added to the window object.